Hey everybody, wanted to post a video response on God's point of view on slavery. This is an issue I've been giving a lot of thought to, and it's really a tough one to answer. So I've written some notes here, so if you see me reading from time to time, I apologize. But let me just respond first by understanding the argument. See, I could just as easily prove that moral relativist point is wrong by saying that slavery is morally right, that God called for it and we should take people as slaves. I would assume that such a response to that claim would call for, my hanging, and deservingly so. I mean, nobody would say that slavery is morally good. In fact, it's certainly morally reprehensible, and it should not be condoned. See, but the point is, as soon as moral relativists make a moral judgment against me for believing that slavery is right, then they're not being morally neutral. And in fact, they're proving that there are certain moral absolutes, or there are times when a view is simply wrong, and your view is simply right. So with that being said, how do Christians deal with slavery? I first have to admit that we have very little ground to stand on here. It does seem to me, from reading the Bible, that God is condoning slavery. The point made by Storm Trek in his response video is certainly the standard answer, but frankly it's a little weak. We don't have much of an argument here. Also, I think the argument from ProfMTH, which is extremely lucid and almost intimidating to respond to, it's so good, it does have a tiny hole. However, I have to admit that I haven't watched part 2 yet, and so possibly that hole's been closed. But just responding on part 1, I think it should be said that only make the argument for God being inconsistent, or that you only make the argument for God being inconsistent in his moral judgments. But that doesn't necessarily mean that moral objectivism is untrue. It seems to me that there are two things that we can glean from ProfMTH's video. Number one is God is either inconsistent, or number two, we are incorrect in interpreting God's will on slavery. Both are perfectly logical response or points. However, I lean towards the latter, not just because I have a naturalistic bias, though I most definitely do. At least I can admit to that fact. But because I think we have history on my side, and I'll go into that further in a minute. It's certainly hard to debate that Christians and Jews are for slavery in any way. Christians have always been at the forefront of social change, and in fact, they led the fight on slavery. William Wilberforce, for instance, a devout Christian, spent his entire life, literally his entire life, combating against the immoral institution. And you can watch the movie on his life. I think it paints a better picture than I can in a small video. Even today, many Christian institutions are fighting against slavery in Africa, India, and the Middle East. Even pseudo-slavery type institutions have been typically condemned by Christians, such as child labor laws. So that we have no direct, I think very strong direct answer to God's opinion on slavery. But since Christians have been at the forefront of banning slavery on the earth, I think a charitable response to the argument is that we simply are misinterpreting God's will on this issue. I would assume that without opening up a hornet's nest, if the country was to be run by moral relativists in the 1860s, we would still have slavery, because a true relativist would have to remain morally neutral on the issue. And the fact is moral neutrality simply doesn't start social change. So, like I said, maybe a weak argument, but I think a charitable one. We seem to have history on our side that shows that God's chosen people have always been at the forefront of banning slavery and the forefront of social change. So I hope that answers some things. Like I said, I assume I opened up a hornet's nest by making a direct attack on moral relativism, but that's fine by me. Take it easy.